Hey, everybody, welcome back. This is episode 3 of the Determined for More podcast series for our workshops. We are starting today part 1 of a 2-part series on communication. This will be a podcast on expressive communication within the relationship, and then next time we'll be talking about receptive communication. So, Shauna, you want to kick us off and share a little bit about what those are and why they're so important?
Yeah, sure. So expressive communication, when we say that is how we express ourselves, what we say, how we say it, whereas receptive is what we receive. So when we're the listener, we're in the receptive communication mode, and when we're expressing, we are in the speaker, kind of relational mode. So really today, we had to break this up into 2 parts because it's a lot. There's a lot to cover. So I'm sure we're going to go right up to the 30-minute mark, which we try to keep our podcast at 30 minutes so you guys can absorb what we have to share and we don't overwhelm you or flood you with information. So we think that's really important as we talk about being in a neurodiverse marriage and how much we've learned around that. And also coming off of, just a history of betrayal and emotional deprivation in our story. And I know a lot of our listeners are in that place too. So we welcome you here. We're so glad you're here. And we hope that today is really helpful as we talk about expressive communication. So the first thing that I think of is what we say. So when we talk about that, we're talking about what we say, what words are coming out of our mouth, what is our body language, what is our facial expression. We are saying a lot beyond our words, and how we're expressing ourselves. So thinking about that, one of the things that was important to us is to recognize our different ways of communicating. And we still have a lot of different ways of communicating, and we still fumble, and we still have to, choose to, pick up the ball and say, all right, let's try that again. So we're going to share a resource towards the latter half of the podcast called a redo or a do-over. Some of you might do that. You might have never heard that word before, but we're going to share that with you too. But the first thing that I want to say is being in a neurodiverse relationship, the way we express ourselves can be very different. And every couple is different. So just as we talked about in episode 1, I just want to remind us that being in any relationship is unique. So we really want to, just acknowledge that. So what we're sharing here is from our experience and what we've seen from other couples and how we generally want to help support. So we do see this different. I'll just share a couple intro things. How's that? And then We'll dive right into some of the concepts and ideas around expressive communication. So one of the things is when I express myself with more words than you. I express
a lot more at times.
A lot more. I express myself in a lot more detail most of the time than you. Sometimes if it's a very particular interest of yours, you might express a lot, and I'm like, I can't take it all in. But most of the time I'm expressing in a lot of detail, and most of the time you're cutting to the chase. You're less words, you're expressing yourself in whatever pops into your mind. I'm not saying that you don't have thought around it, but the speed of what you say sometimes can be fast and sometimes it can be slower. So it's really interesting now that I say it out loud. Whereas if I have a thought, usually I'm filtering it pretty quickly in my mind, and it's zipping all around my right brain over to my left brain to my frontal brain, and it's moving out of my mouth. And sometimes that can cause disruption for us, for sure. Yeah. And I don't think we're alone in that. I think that's common in all relationships to have different concepts of how we express ourselves. But I think the big part is in a neurodiverse relationship, which is mostly why we're here, is learning how to express ourselves well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important, and you mentioned it earlier, for those with neurodiversity, is the expressive communication is not just the words that we say. It's our nonverbal, it's our facial expressions. And so many times I'll say something, and the words will say one thing, and the face says something completely different. And that can be very confusing to the partner in a relationship with that. The other thing is as Shauna was sharing, the thoughts kind of go from when you said the left side of my brain, the right side, whatever you were
right,
sharing.
Left, front.
I'm processing that as well, and it's a spiral. It's all over in the brain. It's bouncing everywhere, and that thought and it grabs other thoughts, and then there are multiple thoughts, and before the words come out of my mouth, I have had 10 different ways of looking at that and saying what I'm going to say. And as you said, I think about my words sometimes. For the neurodiverse, that's often not the case. Many times, for me, I will say things, and I know you'll look at me, or the kids will look at me and be like, "Did you just say that?" And then I'll even be like, wait, what did I just say that? What did I say?
It's like the filter is missing sometimes.
Yeah, or it can be clogged, yeah, or sometimes there's just no filter. And so
yep, that's the missing part.
And so really just looking at those different types of communication styles and expressions can be so important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think other times I will say, if I'm expressing myself, and I'm not getting receptive, which we'll talk about that. Obviously, communication goes both ways. We're not just having a one-way conversation. But if I'm expressing myself in a vulnerable place and you don't respond, then my next expressive thing is going to often be a body language, a facial expression, which that can get you off track. I notice is really recognizing that can get you off track of, well, why'd you make that face? Well, what was that for? And then you're trying to figure out the next thing rather than the first thing that maybe came out of my mouth that you haven't responded to. So sometimes it's a lack of response when I'm expressing myself, which again, we'll talk about the receptive part, but I want to point out that my tone can really throw you off too. So I've got to be careful with how I communicate and what my expression, because he's trying to filter that. So how I communicate is really important, how I express myself. I use my hands a lot. You probably see them in the videos. You do too sometimes, but I use my hands a lot, and that can throw him off because he's trying to figure out, what are your hands trying to do? And he'll look at my hands and going, oh, my hands are just going along with what my words are saying. But you're trying to concentrate so much on all of the stuff that, sometimes I'll sit up my hands just so my words can be spoken, or I can slow it down and say less. Sometimes that can help us a lot if I say a little bit less so that you can receive that. But so that it doesn't come in so fast for you. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I think kind of staying on the expressive side of things as well. Often for me, I think my expressive side can often go one of two ways. I can maybe very quickly express and very quickly respond. And then sometimes Shauna's like, hello, are you still in the conversation? And I can be very slow, as you were saying, to respond because I'm trying to process what you just said and understand it. And that's one of the things that we can get caught up on in expressive communication is, as you were saying, it's two parts. It's the receptive part, and before sometimes I can express again, I have to process. And so there can be a delay in my expression or my expressive communication. And in that delay, as Shauna mentioned, she may give me a look like, hello, are you still there? Which then can be very distracting for me. And now I've just completely forgotten what she said. Now I'm focused on, what was that look for? What did that mean? What is she trying to tell me? and so I can get caught off on that.
Yeah. And yeah, I almost want to run to the receptive communication, but we're going to stay really focused on expressive. One of the things I think in expressive communication that I want to share, that when I share what we call our central coherence in seeing full picture of things is a little bit stronger than your central coherence. So meaning you look at the details
Very
of the
linearly.
trees very linearly. Is that a right word? Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
But you look at those details in what I'm saying and go after like one word. And I'm looking at the big picture of the forest, right? You're in the trees, I'm in the forest, and I'm going, but it's the whole concept. I want you to understand the concept. So when I go to express that, sometimes I need to go to the trees to express that and then bring it back up and say, well, this is conceptual, or, this is the broader picture that I'm trying to say there. So I think that helps us when I'm expressing myself, and so that I don't flood you or us in that moment.
Yeah. And one of the key things to that point that you had shared is kind of breaking that up, right? Breaking up those sections, and really allowing the time to process each of those thought processes, where you can look at the whole forest, right? I'm looking at the redwood tree, and you're talking about the redwoods, the sequoias, the elm trees, the birch trees, and I'll be like, wait,
glad you know all those trees, by the way. Where are we, in Yosemite?
But and I will often, are we on this tree, that tree, where are we?
And trying to follow what I'm trying to express.
Yeah.
And I think because as I'm expressing my, different things and how I express, my tone can go up and down, my volume can go up and down, and I think you're sensitive to that, which we'll talk more about that later. But I think when it's not linear, I'll sometimes say, like, I don't talk in a tunnel. Like, I'm more like a funnel. Or it's not like a train. Whereas if I don't make it to that next station, you don't understand what I'm saying. And so, right, that can kind of be frustrating sometimes for us in how I express or how you express, because it's so different.
Yeah.
It's so different.
Well, and let's talk about that tone and that volume for a second. If you have ever talked with me before, and if you could see us here, there's times that Shauna's like, quiet down, you're getting loud again. I have a very natural loud voice, and I always have.
It's kind of unmodulated. Is that what we say?
Unmodulated is kind of in the neurodiverse, where they would talk about that, and a lack of awareness of the volume of my speech. And so oftentimes those with a neurodiversity can be very loud,
or very quiet
in communications.
Yeah.
And to that point,
I think both.
Depending upon the characteristics and how someone personalities, it can also be a very flat affect, can be very unemotional, very just flat.
I think you do have sometimes a very flat affect, even when you're exaggerated in your tone or your volume. I think sometimes you can have a flat affect of like, no, I'm really happy. And I'm like, oh, you're saying it very differently than I'm used to hearing that. That doesn't feel like happy. I don't see happy. So I'm looking for all the other things, but you're expressing it in, a more flat affect. And sometimes that's different. You're also very extroverted in comparison. And so sometimes if someone's more introverted, they might not express as, boldly or...
Yeah. Well, and I know I have to be careful that because I have a louder voice, that if I have a loud voice and my nonverbal facial tone is off, I can really be conveying a message of anger when that is not at all my motive or my intention, and it can, but it comes across that way.
Intensity a lot, but it does come across of like, ooh, like that's too intense for me in that moment. So
Yeah.
that, and I'm striving for peace. That's a high value for me. So I'm looking for that in your volume. I'll say, oh. And so instead of taking it personally in that, I think we've learned a little bit around that is when you do express in that way, I can ask you, are you frustrated with that? No, I'm not really frustrated with that. I'm confused, or I'm this, or I'm that. And so how about we introduce the redo a little bit here, a little bit more, or a do-over.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I'll say things like, can you redo that? Can you have a do-over? And when you're in a state of receiving my feedback and taking that on, then that way, I think you do interact better with me and say, yeah, let me redo that. When you're in more of a defensive stance, that's not usually coming across. But I think the redo, really, it's just start back from where we were. What were you trying to say? And just say it differently. Sometimes I'll say, can you redo that at a lower volume? Can you redo that with less facial expression, or without your brows furrowed, right? Something like that.
Well, and you had shared earlier a little bit about the expressive. It can be, sometimes a lot of words or sometimes a few words, right? And sometimes when it's just a few words, that might come across very harsh or very sharp or very rude in its tone. That's. I mean, I think. I mean, I've heard that from you and from kids, and that for
Our
decades.
kids, yeah.
Like wow, that was rude, and that was not. I wasn't trying to be rude, and that I think is where the redo comes in. Wow, that was really rude. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Can I have a redo in that? Can I try that again?
On good moments, you'll
on
ask
good
for
moments,
them now.
right? I mean, that's the goal. Is that based upon when I express, based upon the expression of how it was received, I may be able to identify that I need a redo. Sometimes, you may say, ouch, that kind of hurt. That was a little sharp. That was a little,
you sharp, or
and again, if I'm regulated and in a good place, I might hear that and hear, okay, try a redo there because something came off. And then sometimes you may just say, could you redo that? Right. I think you're probably a little more direct in that when you are recognizing I may not be as attuned to the situation and helping bring me to that.
That directness, I think I wasn't, well, first of all, I need you to receive that, right? So that I know that if I say, knock it off or watch that tone, I can say it very directly, not even sometimes not with a lot of emotion, but watch that tone, and you will receive that better. So again, this is two-way, but I think it's important that, that I can be direct about it and that you can be direct with me when you're expressing things. Because a lot of times, I want to touch on this real quick. I think you didn't recognize, and this took me a while too, to recognize what I needed in a moment of, I need a softer tone. Sometimes I'll just say, knock it off or watch your tone very directly. And sometimes I'll say, I need a softer tone. And saying what we need, not what we don't need, has helped us a lot. We don't always do it, but I think recognizing like, I need a softer tone. Oh, okay, I can do that. Does that make sense?
It does. And I want to point out one thing that you just did there that you're really good at. In this situation, when there seems like there's communication challenge and maybe things are getting heightened a little bit, right? I fully understand from a partner standpoint to get frustrated. I fully understand like how hard it can be sometimes having conversation with someone that has neurodiversity and has struggles with communication. When Shauna has a need and is trying to express that to me, and she says, in a very boisterous tone, because that's, it's been escalating, right? could you just do that different, right? I need that softer. To me, the volume, the tone did not bring soft out of me. It brought my expression even louder again.
Yeah.
But you just shared, I've really gotten good at saying
better not always,
at saying what I need, and I need you to do that softer. And she's in essence modeling for me what that looks like, and showing me to express yourself softer sounds like this. It looks like this. Because I may have no awareness in my expression of being able to be softer.
Yeah, and I think you follow naturally as you're trying to figure out the world sometimes and how to communicate it and trying to figure out formulas, is you are modeling after me. Sometimes I'd be like, stop riding on my coattails, stop following what I'm saying. You will mirror a lot of what I say, or I don't mean mimic in a negative way.
No, it is.
I just, there's like, oh, you said that? Well, that must be appropriate to say right here. And so that part, I think, it can be hard at times for me to be the one that's kind of leading that tone when I'm like, oh my gosh. And sometimes I just say, knock it off. Like, I can't stand that tone right now. I will say that, but other times kind of bringing that back. So just to a better place. So
I think you brought up an important part there too around, what I would say the social component of expressive behavior. So I know oftentimes if we were to go to a social gathering or even a family event, a Christmas event or a birthday party, that for somebody that is neurodiverse, the expressive part of communicating and carrying on social interactions and carrying on small talk with people, small talk can be exhausting sometimes for me, of being able to read that, engage that, and figure out, masking and coping skills and mimicking and what it might look like for me to be able to expressively communicate and be a part of a conversation in a social environment can often be very overwhelming.
Because I know you've shared this before, so I don't think I'm sharing anything you wouldn't want to share. We're a pretty open book over here and talking about a lot of things. Literally. The book, we talk about a lot of things, but the flooding and the anxiety that can come up in those social situations when you're going to express yourself, especially if it's new or you don't feel as confident. Do you want to talk just for a minute or so around kind of what happens internally for you in those social environments with the anxiety and like, what should I say? And the flooding of like emotion and sensation.
Yeah, it's and I know probably the neurodiverse people on the podcast are going, okay, I can already feel it as she's saying that, right? It's there is a very, for me, it is a sense of tension that I feel. It's tension mentally, it's tension emotionally. And it becomes tension physically as I
like in your chest. You're kind of like I can your hands on your chest. Those that can't see us
feel that tension. And so with that, as I move into those social settings and try to, in essence, read the room and figure out where can I fit, oftentimes in those highly expressive situations, folks with neurodiversity and that may kind of seclude themselves to the corner. They may find the quieter spaces, right? Again, in very highly expressive situations, they're loud. And so they can be a sensory trigger there as well. And so there's a sensory trigger, there's an emotional trigger, there's a physical trigger there. There's
those fear of like, I'm not going to know what to say, or how am I going to keep up in these conversations?
Yeah. I don't relate. I don't know. I can't relate to the conversations in that too.
Yeah. One of the things, just as you're saying that, and you're very social, I would say, in a lot of ways, but again, there was a lot of masking for you. But I think you learned how to be social. But in our family system, we have 4 kiddos, and when you were diagnosed with autism, the kids didn't really see it. But now, once they've been learning about like, oh, on Easter, just this past Easter, when you got up from the table and not everybody was done eating, it's not that you don't know that that's not socially appropriate, but I think the overwhelm, you get up and you are washing the dishes. Probably, I'm guessing, I don't know if I've ever asked you, but I'm guessing for like the input on your hands and the warmth, and I have a task to do, and the crosstalk, I know we've talked about this, the crosstalk at the dinner table was so overwhelming. And I'm like,
there were
get your butt back to the table.
8
Like, what are you
people
doing? Like, why are you leaving? This is not appropriate. You know, so I'm judging that, but we didn't realize that. You didn't even realize, like, that's too much for me. But now that we know that, then our kids are like, look over, why is dad doing the dishes? And at the end of the day, like, that's a task versus the relationship, which is easier for you. But I think that crosstalk tends to overwhelm and bring up a lot of anxiety and just I don't know.
It does. It brings up a lot of overwhelmness.
Yeah.
And so I think the best way that I could describe that is that if you and I are having a conversation, my brain is having 1,000 thoughts in that conversation. If I'm at a table with 8 people and there are 4 different conversations going on, my brain is now having 4,000 things firing around in it from all those conversations, and it becomes very overwhelming and very exhausting in that.
And you'll say a lot of times, like, you know, this is overwhelming, I need to stand up, rather than getting frustrated and having like a mini meltdown, and then being like, you guys are talking too much, or you didn't, like, or nobody's including me in this conversation.
Trying to control the conversation.
Correct. That's where the behavior of this, we're going to talk about this more. We're going to talk about some code words and things like that in the later episodes. And what do we do when you do have, you know, a little meltdown of sorts, or blame, or do something destructive in that moment. So we'll talk about that more for the listeners if they're like, well, what do we do when? That sounds great if he does not have a meltdown, or you know, and when I say meltdown, I'm referring to just kind of a little blaming tizzy of sorts that would happen, or saying, you guys are all doing this and I can't follow along and it's because of you. And so that would create a lot of responsibility for me. So yeah. So do you want to say anything else as we
I think as we wrap up, I think there's one last kind of idea of expressive communication that I would like to just make sure that we address, and that is monologuing. And so one of the other kind of characteristics of neurodiversity is this concept of monologuing. And what monologuing is where the individual who is expressing the communication gets on a topic and just goes and goes and goes and goes. Not even cueing in to the people they're communicating to are no longer listening. Maybe they've even gotten up and moved on.
True.
And I think we all maybe have been caught in a situation like that, whether the person was neurodiverse or not, where we feel stuck in a conversation. But the monologuing is where the individual expresses and continues to express and express and express without engaging the other person into the conversation. It in essence is one-way communication. It is just expressive. And quite honestly, in that situation, not even looking to have any receptive component. It is literally sometimes you'll say you're on a dissertation, right? You're just one track and focused. So and that is a common characteristic in communication challenges that to be honest, I'm not aware of that necessarily at times. And Shauna may need to give me a little cue, like, okay, can you pause? Can you take a break?
Because even the tap on the knee didn't work for us. Like, I'm tapping you on the knee and you're like, why are you hitting my knee?
Don't interrupt my monologue.
Like, why'd you stop that? And we'd be in a social situation. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. What do we do now? So I'm glad you brought up monologuing versus dialoguing, because dialoguing is where we have the two-way conversation. So speaking of that,
which we will jump into next.
So we'll actually pick this conversation back up. This is part of the series. It's a little bit of part 1, part 2, expressive communication and receptive. And so next episode 4, we're going to be talking about receptive communication. So we will pick that up there. We look forward to just spending that time with you guys, and wish we could all be in the same room, but we do have some workshops that are available, some live and then some that are recorded, so that you can dive into these topics a little bit more and gain some more tools, and how do we do that redo and those sorts of things. So we look forward to seeing you. If you have any questions or comments or want to reach out to us, it's www.livingstonescoaching.com. We have a contacts page. We have a lot of resources for you there. There's a lot of free resources. There's, the information about the book and the workshops and all of that there too. So we look forward to seeing you and chatting with you on the next episode.
See you next time.